While the world is locked onto Tehran, watching missiles, blockades, and nuclear negotiations, a far greater strategic earthquake is unfolding in silence. And, the country at the center of it hasn't had a single bomb dropped on its soil. No shots fired, no territory invaded, yet it is absorbing one of the most devastating strategic blows of the entire Iran conflict. That country is China, and today, the 30th of April, 2026, we're going to show you exactly how Beijing's $400 billion empire just collapsed in real time. Over the past 48 hours, I've gone deep. Diplomatic cables, Bloomberg intelligence reports, Hudson Institute assessments, and live economic data. What I found is, well, the dramatic unraveling of a carefully constructed architecture that took more than a decade to build. This is World Brief Live, where we cover the military, geopolitical, and economic stories that are genuinely reshaping the global order. What you're about to hear is how China's $400 billion strategic partnership with Iran has shattered, how the Hormuz blockade is strangling Chinese factories as we speak, and why Xi Jinping's so-called fortress economy is cracking from the inside out, faster than most analysts are willing to publicly admit. Over the past 10 years, Beijing poured enormous resources into transforming Iran into its indispensable land bridge to the Middle East, the cornerstone of the Belt and Road Initiative's westward expansion, and its primary source of deeply discounted energy. Everything was built around one central assumption, that this relationship would remain stable and secure. That assumption has now been shattered. Without firing a single shot at China, the United States and its allies have dismantled the very foundation of Beijing's Middle East strategy. The $400 billion bridge is gone, the shadow oil fleet is being hunted, and the strategic lifeline Beijing depended on has been severed. This is not just another regional crisis. This is, the most underreported and perhaps most consequential dimension of the current Iran war. Because what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz today is exposing deep vulnerabilities in the world's second largest economy in ways that will carry consequences for years to come. To understand the full scale of this disaster for China, we need to go back and examine what Beijing actually built in Iran over the past decade. In March 2021, China and Iran signed a landmark 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership agreement worth an estimated $400 billion. On paper, it was presented as a grand alliance between two civilizations. In reality, it was the cornerstone of Xi Jinping's vision for westward expansion through the Belt and Road Initiative. Iran was never just another partner. It was designed to become China's indispensable land bridge, the central node in the China-Central Asia-West Asia economic corridor. Beijing saw Iran as the perfect gateway, resource-rich, strategically located, and under heavy Western sanctions, which, made it dependent on Chinese capital and technology. Chinese companies moved in aggressively. CNPC took major stakes in the South Pars gas field, one of the largest in the world. Chinese firms poured billions into Iran's mineral sector, including copper, gold, and lithium. Huawei built much of Iran's 5G backbone and telecommunications infrastructure. And most critically, China financed and helped construct the Chabahar and Jask ports, designed specifically as exclusive oil export terminals that would allow Iranian crude to reach Chinese refineries while completely bypassing the Strait of Hormuz in the event of conflict. But the real lifeline was hidden in plain sight, the shadow fleet. For years, hundreds of aging tankers operating under false flags with spoofed transponders and ship-to-ship transfers off Malaysia's coast moved discounted Iranian oil directly into Chinese refineries. At its peak, China purchased nearly 90% of Iran's total oil exports, providing the sanctioned regime with its only reliable financial artery. This was not a traditional military alliance. Beijing never promised to defend Iran militarily. Instead, it was a cold, calculated resource extraction arrangement cleverly disguised as South-South friendship and strategic partnership. China got cheap energy and a strategic foothold in the Middle East. Iran got capital, technology, and diplomatic cover. When Israeli and American strikes began hammering Iranian targets on the 28th of February 2026, the true nature of this relationship was exposed within days. Despite the $400 billion deal and years of public declarations of solidarity, China's response was, well, strikingly muted. Beijing issued standard statements criticizing the attacks and calling for restraint, but offered no meaningful military, intelligence, or even strong diplomatic support to its so-called strategic partner. That silence spoke volumes. When Iran needed its most powerful patron most, China chose self-preservation over solidarity. The $400 billion partnership, once hailed as a triumph of Chinese diplomacy, suddenly revealed itself for what it had always been, a transactional business arrangement dressed up in diplomatic language. Now, with Iranian territory under heavy attack and its leadership disrupted, billions of dollars in Chinese investments, ports, pipelines, telecom networks, energy projects have been transformed almost overnight from strategic assets into toxic liabilities. What was supposed to be China's secure Western gateway has become a burning bridge. And that is only the beginning, because the real damage wasn't caused by the bombs falling on Iran. The fatal blow came from something else entirely: the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the naval blockade that followed. When the United States and its allies imposed a full naval blockade on Iranian ports and began intercepting vessels linked to the Shadow Fleet, Beijing's response was, painfully revealing. China's foreign ministry called the blockade dangerous and irresponsible. Spokesman Guo Jiakun stated that only a full ceasefire can ease the situation, and that Beijing would make, and I want you to note this word carefully, efforts to help restore peace and stability. Efforts. While 34 vessels were turned back by American destroyers, while Chinese-bound tankers were being intercepted in the Gulf of Oman. While the cheap Iranian oil lifeline that had sustained Chinese refineries for years suddenly ran dry, Beijing offered nothing but efforts. That single word tells you everything you know about the true strength of the so-called China-Iran strategic partnership. After investing $400 billion in positioning Iran as the cornerstone of its westward ambitions, China could only muster diplomatic language and vague promises. The Shadow Fleet that Beijing had relied upon for years was built precisely for this kind of scenario: false flags, disabled transponders, nighttime ship-to-ship transfers. Chinese customs records officially show zero direct imports from Iran since 2022. Yet in 2024, China recorded 1.3 million barrels per day of so-called Malaysian crude, more than double Malaysia's total production capacity. That oil was Iranian. Everyone in the industry knew it, and that covert energy bridge has now been severed. On the 19th of April, 2026, U.S. forces seized the sanctioned Iranian container ship MV Tuska in the Gulf of Oman, reportedly carrying dual-use equipment on its return voyage from China. This was not simply a blockade of Iranian ports. This was a systematic hunt of the entire shadow network that kept discounted energy flowing into Chinese refineries. China maintains strategic petroleum reserves equivalent to roughly 120 days of imports. On the surface, that sounds like a reasonable buffer. In reality, it is a ticking countdown, because 120 days is not a long-term solution. It is borrowed time. Look at the numbers that truly matter. China imports at least 5.4 million barrels of oil per day through the Strait of Hormuz. Russia, by comparison, exports around 2.1 million barrels per day to China, even after a recent increase. Gulf oil flowing through Hormuz is more than double what China receives from Russia. The notion that Beijing can simply pivot to Russian supply is mathematically impossible. Russia lacks both the pipeline capacity and the tanker fleet to replace Iranian and Middle Eastern supplies at this scale. Even Russian seaborne oil must pass through vulnerable choke points that the U.S. Navy could interdict if necessary. While Chinese state media tries to project calm, the reality on the ground is becoming impossible to conceal. The Hormuz blockade has not only cut off Beijing's cheapest source of crude, it has sent shockwaves through every linked supply chain. And this is no longer just a foreign policy problem, it has become a domestic economic emergency. Because when energy prices spike and critical raw material flows are disrupted, the impact doesn't stay in the Middle East. It travels straight into Chinese factories, ports, and ultimately Chinese workers' lives. The fortress economy that Xi Jinping has spent years promoting is beginning to show serious cracks that widen with every week the blockade continues. Chinese auto plants produced 27% fewer cars in the first 2 weeks of April compared to the same period last year. According to Alicia Garcia Herrero, chief economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis, China's economy is slowing sharply and may struggle to meet its already modest annual growth target of 4.5. But the numbers, well, only tell part of the story. The human and industrial reality is more alarming. On April 20th, thousands of workers in southern China staged protests after factories abruptly shut down. In cities like Dongguan and Foshan, banners reading, "Return my blood and sweat money," hung on locked factory gates. Videos circulating on Chinese social media, before being quickly censored, showed workers standing quietly as police monitored the scene. In a country where public protest carries serious personal risk, the fact that workers still took to the streets reveals, just how severe the pressure has become. Why did these factories close so suddenly? Because plastic prices surged almost overnight after shipping disruptions through Hormuz cut off key petrochemical feedstocks. Margins collapsed, production became unprofitable, doors were simply shut. This is not an isolated incident. Half of the world's seaborne trade in sulfur, a critical industrial input, flows through the Strait of Hormuz. Disruptions have already affected petrochemical complexes and fertilizer production, pushing global food prices higher. Meanwhile, damage to aluminum smelters in Bahrain and the Emirates has created a serious shortage of automotive-grade aluminum, felt by Toyota, Nissan, BMW, and Hyundai alike. But no country, feels it more acutely than China. Chinese manufacturers need aluminum for electric vehicles, sulfur for industrial processing, and petrochemicals for plastics used in everything from consumer electronics to auto parts and packaging. When these inputs are suddenly restricted or become dramatically more expensive, China's greatest competitive advantage, its low-cost, high-volume manufacturing base, comes under existential pressure. Even more telling was the U.S. decision in April 2026 to sanction one of China's largest teapot refineries, the Hengli Petrochemical Dalian refinery, for continuing to process Iranian crude. This was not a warning shot. It was a direct message. Washington knows exactly which Chinese facilities are handling sanctioned oil, and it is prepared to reach inside China's domestic industrial base to apply pressure. Beijing's response? Once again, the foreign ministry spoke of efforts to restore peace. The broader picture is, sobering. China's leadership had already set its lowest growth target since the early 1990s. Now, on top of a slowing economy they were struggling to stimulate, they faced spiking raw material costs across multiple sectors simultaneously. The automotive industry, Beijing's flagship for its transition into EVs and high-tech manufacturing, is taking a particularly heavy hit. Semiconductors, next-generation batteries, and consumer electronics are all absorbing the secondary effects of this energy and materials shock. Shortages of industrial inputs are making it increasingly difficult for China to hit even its reduced 2026 growth targets. A prolonged conflict that slows global growth presents an even greater risk given China's deep dependence on exports. This is the uncomfortable truth Beijing must now confront. Its fortress economy was never as fortified as the propaganda claimed. When critical supply lines are severed halfway across the world, the walls begin to crack, not from external bombs, but from internal economic pressure. Workers demanding unpaid wages, factory owners watching margins evaporate, local governments facing falling tax revenues. The Hormuz blockade has achieved something remarkable. It has turned abstract geopolitical tension into concrete pain felt in cities and provinces across China. And with every passing week, the strait remains contested. Those cracks grow wider and deeper. Beyond the immediate economic pain, the Hormuz crisis has delivered a fatal blow to something even more important for Beijing: the credibility and future viability of its entire Belt and Road Initiative. Since 2005, China has invested more than $269 billion in infrastructure across the Middle East: ports, pipelines, highways, and power plants. The core promise to every participating country was simple: China is a stable, reliable partner that delivers economic development without Western-style political conditions. Iran was supposed to be the shining example of this model, Beijing's flagship partner and the anchor of its westward expansion. That promise now lies in ruins. When Iran's leadership was decapitated on February 28th and its territory came under sustained attack, Beijing did, well, almost nothing. While the UAE joined a US-led coalition and called for the reopening of the strait, China remained largely silent. Gulf monarchies, Pakistan, Indonesia, Central Asian states, and African partners have been watching closely. They have seen what Chinese strategic cooperation really looks like when American military power enters the equation. The question now being asked openly in capitals from Riyadh to Jakarta to Islamabad is brutal but fair. Is China a reliable long-term partner, or merely a buyer of cheap resources that disappears when real security risks appear? This erosion of trust may prove more damaging than the immediate loss of oil. Once lost, strategic confidence is extremely difficult to rebuild. The implicit security umbrella China tried to offer through economic dependence has been exposed as hollow. But the deepest strategic lesson lies further east. The Strait of Malacca, located between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, only 3 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, carries more than 80% of China's imported crude oil and roughly 25% of global maritime trade. The United States maintains military advantages at both ends of this choke point through bases in Singapore, Diego Garcia, Japan, and Guam. What the Hormuz crisis has demonstrated with brutal clarity is that choke points can be militarized quickly and effectively. The U.S. has shown it can close a strategic strait against a heavily armed opponent while keeping global trade flowing for everyone else and maintaining plausible deniability. Chinese strategists are now forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. If Washington can do this in Hormuz, it can certainly do it in Malacca, and with even greater effectiveness. A Chinese research fellow at East China Normal University recently warned in the South China Morning Post that the U.S. is, refining a global maritime blockade strategy specifically designed to contain China's rise, calling it, quote, an unchangeable reality. That assessment, published in a Chinese-affiliated outlet, carries significant weight. This is why the Malacca dilemma, first articulated by former President Hu Jintao, has returned to haunt Beijing with new urgency. Electric vehicles and renewable energy are part of China's long-term answer to reduce oil dependence. But these solutions will take years to fully implement. They offer no protection against a crisis unfolding right now. The Iran war has also destroyed something else: China's laboratory for bypassing sanctions. The shadow financial networks, alternative payment systems, and smuggling techniques developed with Iran have been exposed and systematically dismantled. The techniques are now known. The vulnerabilities have been mapped. For Xi Jinping, the strategic picture is, deeply sobering. The fortress economy was never as impenetrable as advertised. A great power whose lifeblood flows through narrow waterways controlled by its strategic rival is not a fortress. It is a siege waiting to happen. The Hormuz crisis is not just a temporary disruption, it is a structural turning point that will shape Beijing's strategic calculations for decades to come. Here we are, April 30th, 2026. After everything we've examined, the real story is coming into sharp focus. China is not collapsing because of this crisis. Its economy remains massive, and its leadership highly disciplined. Goldman Sachs still projects around 4.8% growth for the year, but the damage is real, lasting, and structural. The $400 billion Iran bridge is gone. The shadow fleet is being hunted. Billions in Belt and Road investments are turning into toxic assets. And most importantly, the United States has demonstrated, in full public view, that it can sever China's critical energy lifelines without firing a single shot at a Chinese vessel, without declaring war, without, even naming China directly. This is modern economic warfare at its most sophisticated. For Xi Jinping personally, this moment is particularly bitter. The fortress economy he has spent years promoting has been exposed as far more fragile than advertised. It is not invincible, it is not insulated. It is a very large economy with dangerously exposed supply lines, and a strategic rival that now knows exactly where those lines run. Beijing still has 60 to 90 days before many refineries will be forced to cut production. How China responds in this window will reveal much about its true leverage in the 21st century. So far, the signals are mixed: active neutrality, quiet diplomacy, a 4-point peace proposal. But everyone, understands that Beijing is negotiating from a position of structural weakness. The world is watching. Gulf states, Asian neighbors, and African partners are all asking the same question. When American power meets Chinese ambition, whose side is safer to be on? The Hormuz crisis is not just about oil or one regional conflict. It is a live-fire demonstration of how the United States can reshape global power balances in the 21st century. That is the story behind the headlines that few are telling loudly enough. If you want to follow every development as this situation evolves, China's strategic retreat, the Malacca dilemma, and whether Xi Jinping's model can survive the pressure ahead, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Is China more vulnerable than it has long projected? How do you see this crisis ending?